Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Marilyn Geller, and I am the Chief Executive of the Celiac Disease Foundation. We are pleased to be presenting this Ask the FDA Educational Webinar featuring our colleagues at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition and at Celiac UK, the national charity for supporting people with celiac disease in the United Kingdom, who are also representing the Association of European Celiac Societies, known as AOECS, of which the Celiac Disease Foundation is a North American affiliate member. For the approximately 1% of people worldwide with celiac disease, and for the millions more who are gluten intolerant, disease management requires strict adherence to a gluten-free diet, which is extremely difficult because gluten is a protein found in wheat, rye, and barley, which make up about 80% of our foodstuffs. So first, a bit of context as we begin today. Before 2013, there were no US standards or definitions for the food industry to use in labeling products as gluten-free. Then in 2014, the US Food and Drug Administration issued a final rule for the voluntary labeling of packaged foods that said that they cannot contain more than 20 parts per million of gluten to be labeled gluten-free. This is a recognized worldwide standard definition and is the lowest level of gluten that can be reliably detected in foods using scientifically validated analytical methods. In 2020, the FDA issued another gluten-free labeling rule that covered fermented and hydrolyzed foods such as cheese, yogurt, vinegar, and beer and wine. The existence of these federal gluten-free labeling rules is a direct result of the 10 years of advocacy work done by the American Celiac Disease Alliance, a coalition that included the Celiac Disease Foundation among its founding members, and we are proud to have secured the implementation of this critical regulatory requirement. While these labeling standards are helpful, some confusion remains in the patient community. Given the central importance of labeling to the well-being of millions of people, we decided to host this webinar with FDA Senior Advisor for Nutrition Policy, Dr. Robin McKinnon, Director of Compliance Policy Staff, Dr. Yingqing Ma, and speaking to us again, food technologist Dr. Carol de Lima, to address questions about these rules. Also joining us today is Celiac UK Chief Executive and AOECS Board Member Hilary Croft, who will discuss European labeling laws for gluten and the way that those differ from the rules issued by the US FDA. Over the last month, we've asked our patient community to submit the questions they want to have answered in this forum, and we will address many of those in the next hour. We thank and appreciate the hundreds of you who responded with questions. If you have follow-up questions, please submit them to info@celiac.org, and we will do our best to post responses in November. Thanks to all of you streaming this webinar live and to those who are watching at a later time. We extend our sincere thanks to the FDA and to Celiac UK and AOECS for their partnership in making the world a safer place for people with celiac disease and gluten intolerance. Dr. McKinnon.
Great. Thank you so much, Marilyn. Thank you for the opportunity to join today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, our presentation. Hopefully that's displaying okay. And so again, thank you again for the opportunity to join. And with my colleagues here, Dr. Yingqing Ma and Carol de Lima. So as Marilyn mentioned, we've developed our presentation based on many of the questions that were submitted to the Celiac Disease Foundation. I'll provide some background and introduction to the presentation, and Dr. de Lima will discuss the gluten-free labeling final rules. Then Dr. Ma will cover the compliance and the enforcement of those rules. And then we'll have a short Q&A discussion. But very briefly, about 20 cents in every consumer dollar in the US is spent on products that are regulated by the FDA. And those include things like food, drugs, medical devices, tobacco, and more. And in terms of our food responsibilities, FDA regulates the safety and labeling of about 80% of the US food supply, which is a critical part of our mission as an agency to protect and promote the public health. And there are about 93,000 domestic registered food facilities and about 124,000 in foreign countries. And overall, about 15% of our food supply is imported. In our labeling and food safety work, we work very closely with our federal and other partners, and those include agencies like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institutes of Health, the US Department of Agriculture, and more. And I know that many of you had questions about how FDA is organized. Why is labeling of gluten, how is that different for food and other product categories like drugs? And there's a lot more detail on how FDA is organized online at fda.gov, so I won't go into great detail. But very briefly, there are different centers within FDA for the major food product categories. And at a high level, FDA regulates different products based on different statutory authorities that are provided by Congress. So CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and CFSAN, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, my colleagues and I are, those are two centers, CDER and CFSAN. Those are two centers within FDA that respectively regulate drugs and food. And there are different authorities that underlie the regulations for these broad categories. There are some similarities between the regulations for drugs and food. So, for instance, products must be honestly and informatively labeled, but also there are many differences as well. And if you think about it, it makes sense. They're very different industries, different manufacturing, with products that are consumed very differently. So it makes sense that there are regulations and different requirements for different industries. And here are some of the key statutes that provide authority to FDA to regulate the safety and labeling of food, including the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as it's amended, for instance, by the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act and FALCPA, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act. And based on these authorities, FDA has pre-market authority, pre-market review, so before products are introduced into the market, of certain things like food and color additives and new dietary ingredient notifications and labeling claims. And we have post-market authority, so after items are introduced into the marketplace for other categories, and those include food labeling, also grade A dairy, so cheese and ice cream, and also other goods like canned foods, acid foods, shell eggs, game meat, fresh fruits and vegetables, processed fruits and vegetables, bottled water, beverages, dietary supplements, cosmetics, and more. I do want to note that USDA has different authorities. The US Department of Agriculture has different authorities and resources also for the foods that they regulate, which is typically meat and poultry. And they have pre-market authority over food labeling, which is different to FDA's authorities in food labeling. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Dr. Carol de Lima, who is going to cover the gluten-free food labeling rules. Go ahead, Carol.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you also to the Celiac Disease Foundation for this opportunity to go over FDA's gluten-free labeling requirements. I'm going to start by briefly going back to the 2004 Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, or FALCPA, that required labeling of the major food allergens. This law is an amendment to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FD&C Act, and it amends two parts of the act, namely Section 201, which deals with definitions, and Section 403, which deals with misbranded food. FALCPA requires that the label of a food that contains an ingredient that is or contains protein from a major food allergen declare the presence of the allergen in a manner described by the law. As you all know, the list of major food allergens includes milk, eggs, fish, crustacean shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soybeans, and effective January 1st, 2023, sesame will be added to the list of major food allergens per the Food Allergy Safety Treatment Education and Research Act, or FASTER Act of 2021. I do want to mention that there are over 160 different foods that cause allergies. However, these 9 are responsible for most of the food allergic reactions. So FACPA covers all packaged foods regulated under the FD&C Act and requires declaration of the major food allergens on the label, either in the list of ingredients or in a contained statement. There are several other provisions under this act, but I won't go into all these details. What I do want to point out is that this law directed the Secretary of Health and Human Services to define and permit the use of the term gluten-free in the labeling of foods. Next slide, please. Before I go into any detail, I wanted to mention again that we have 2 regulations for gluten-free labeling. I think Marilyn covered them, but let me go over them again. So the first one includes the general gluten-free labeling requirements, and the second one outlines the compliance requirements for hydrolyzed and fermented foods. So both were published in the Federal Register, which is the official journal of the US federal government that contains government agency rules, proposed rules, and public notices. Both are also part of Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, in Section 101.91. The Code of Federal Regulations is the codification of regulations of the US federal government agencies. In August 2013, we issued the first regulation defining the term gluten-free for voluntary use in labeling of foods. This means that food products voluntarily bearing a gluten-free claim must meet the rules requirements. FDA's regulation identifies 3 additional claims that are considered to be equivalent to gluten-free. Those are free of gluten, without gluten, and no gluten. FDA also does not endorse, accredit, or recommend any third-party gluten certification program. We are aware that there are some companies or certifying bodies that make use of a symbol or a logo, and manufacturers may use these logos, but FDA is not a certifying body, and we do not use or endorse any symbols or logos. As you all know, gluten is a protein found in wheat, rye, barley, and crossbreeds of these grains. Oats are inherently gluten-free, but can come in contact with gluten-containing grains during production and handling. However, this commingling is preventable. So oats can be labeled as gluten-free or used as an ingredient in a food that is labeled as gluten-free. Just any gluten that is present due to cross-contact would have to be below 20 parts per million. So this rule was intended to help consumers, especially those living with celiac disease, be confident that items labeled gluten-free met a defined standard for gluten content. This was done by ensuring that consumers with celiac disease were provided with truthful, accurate, and not misleading labeling information to better assist them in identifying foods they can consume when following a gluten-free diet. We also hope that it would benefit the food industry by establishing a level playing field among food manufacturers of products labeled as gluten-free. Next slide, please. So in general, the rule states that foods may be labeled gluten-free if they meet the definition and otherwise comply with the final rule's requirements. More specifically, the final rule defines gluten-free as meaning that the food does not contain an ingredient that is a gluten-containing grain like wheat, or an ingredient derived from a gluten-containing grain that has not been processed to remove gluten, like wheat flour, or derived from a gluten-containing grain that has been processed to remove gluten, like wheat starch, if use of that ingredient results in the presence of 20 parts per million or more gluten in the food. So wheat starch is an ingredient that is derived from wheat, which is a gluten-containing grain. It is produced by physical separation from non-starch constituents like gluten. The final rule provides that foods with ingredients that are a gluten-containing grain that have been refined in such a way to remove gluten, like wheat starch, may use a gluten-free claim so long as the food contains less than 20 parts per million of gluten. So wheat is a major food allergen under FALPA, and the term wheat could appear in the contained statement or list of ingredients. In situations where it contains wheat statement or wheat is included in the ingredient statement, along with a gluten-free claim, the regulations ask that an accompanying statement is included, and it should read something like the wheat has been processed to allow this food to meet FDA's requirements for gluten-free foods. This would be preceded by an asterisk or other symbol that links this statement to the word wheat, either in the ingredients list or in the contain statement. Without this, the product would be deemed misbranded. So continuing on with the requirements of the rule, foods that are inherently gluten-free, such as rice and beans, may be labeled as gluten-free so long as they do not go over the 20 parts per million limit. Also, any unavoidable presence of gluten in the food must be less than 20 parts per million. So we use an analytical method-based approach and a safety assessment-based approach to establish our 20 parts per million threshold level. Scientific research conducted this far has shown that products whose gluten levels are less than 20 parts per million should be safe for most individuals with celiac disease. At the time that the rule was being developed, the best analytical method available had a threshold of 20 parts per million as well. Since then, manufacturers have been able to develop technologies that can detect at a lower threshold level. However, using an extremely low level to define gluten-free could cause some manufacturers to stop identifying foods as gluten-free, resulting in fewer foods being labeled as gluten-free. A decrease in the variety of foods labeled as gluten-free would mean that individuals with celiac disease would have to invest more time and effort to identify appropriate foods and could reduce compliance with a gluten-free diet, with a potential adverse health consequence to them. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about the second regulation and how it came about. So at the time that the final rule was being developed, we became aware of some challenges with regard to hydrolyzed and fermented foods. Some examples, as Marilyn mentioned, are like yogurts, cheeses, and also FDA-regulated beers. So we rely on scientifically valid methods to quantify gluten in foods, specifically the sandwich ELISA, which is the enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. This is just an analytical testing tool, and it's commonly used to assess foods for gluten. These assays involve an antigen-antibody reaction, and currently available sandwich ELISA-based methods are not effective in detecting and quantifying intact gluten proteins in fermented and hydrolyzed foods. The sandwich ELISA-based method, designed to detect gluten, requires the presence of two antigenic epitopes. These are antibody binding sites. And so they're not appropriate for fermented and hydrolyzed foods because fermentation or hydrolysis results in gluten peptide fragments being broken apart and resulting in fragments that do not contain the epitopes necessary for a sandwich ELISA to work. So because of this, there's uncertainty in interpreting results that equate to intact gluten for hydrolyzed and fermented foods. So we decided to address these kinds of foods in a separate rule. We went through the rulemaking process and finalized and issued the rule defining the term gluten-free for voluntary use in the labeling of fermented and hydrolyzed foods in August 2020. And that had a compliance date of a year later, which is just August of last year. In this rule, we state that since we do not have appropriate scientifically valid methods, we are providing alternative means for us to verify compliance for fermented and hydrolyzed foods by means of this rule. So just as with all other foods, these foods still have to meet the definition of gluten-free. That means the requirements that I mentioned a slide ago would still apply to these types of foods. I wanted to mention also that our research group at FDA is currently working on developing analytical tools that would be capable of giving results that equate to intact gluten for hydrolyzed and fermented foods. So hopefully in the near future, we would not have these additional requirements for fermented and hydrolyzed food. But until then, besides meeting the requirements of gluten-free final rule, the manufacturers of these kinds of foods that wish to make a gluten-free claim would also have to demonstrate that their products contain less than 20 parts per million intact gluten before fermentation or hydrolysis. Also, that no gluten was introduced during the fermentation or hydrolysis process or during manufacturing due to cross-contact. This would be done using records showing that the manufacturer adequately evaluated the processing for a potential of gluten cross-contact, and where the potential for cross-contact had been identified, the manufacturer has implemented measures to prevent introduction of gluten into the food during the manufacturing process. Also covered in this rule are distilled foods. Examples of distilled foods include vinegars and some distilled water. The 2020 final rule clarifies that in most cases, it is unlikely that gluten will be present in distilled foods or ingredients because distillation is a purification process that separates volatile components like alcohol and flavors from non-volatile materials like proteins and sugars. However, this would depend on the adequacy of the distillation process. Protein testing using scientifically valid methods to measure the protein content can be done to confirm that no detectable protein is present and thus no gluten in the distilled ingredients. Since distillation is capable of removing all protein, including gluten, it would be considered as a process to remove gluten. And so an ingredient that is derived from a gluten-containing grain that has been properly distilled would be allowed to use a gluten-free claim because the ingredient would meet the requirements of the gluten-free rule. So as I said before, these records must provide adequate assurance that the food or ingredients comply with the gluten-free rule before fermentation or hydrolysis. The assurances could include records of test results conducted by the manufacturer or an ingredient supplier, certificates of analysis, or other appropriate verification documentation for the food itself or each of the ingredients used in the food. We expect such foods to be manufactured using whatever controls are necessary to prevent cross-contact with all gluten sources. The manufacturers must also ensure that any amount of gluten that may be present in the food from gluten cross-contact is less than 20 parts per million. Under the rule, the manufacturers would have to keep these records for at least 2 years after the food enters interstate commerce. And they would have to provide these records to us for examination and copying upon request during an inspection. So we got a lot of questions from stakeholders asking for clarification about our regulations surrounding allergen and gluten-free labeling. So I put together this table to help explain it. If you look at the table, the first column covers major food allergen. So FALCPA and the FASTER Act regulate the major food allergens. There are 9 major food allergens. Well, come January, there'll be 9 major food allergens. And the law requires that major food allergens are declared on the label in the ingredients list or the contain statement. These major food allergens so the common name has to be used, and it has to be in the contain statement or the ingredient list. And these allergens are IgE mediated. They cause allergic reactions that are IgE mediated, and the labeling for these are mandatory. If you look at the second column, those here I'm going to cover allergen advisory statements. So the requirements FDA has for allergen advisory statements are that they be truthful and not misleading and not used as a substitute for good manufacturing practices. So these allergen advisory statements would be what you say would be like the may contains allergen or made on the same line or made in the same facility. So these sometimes include the major food allergens, sometimes they include other ingredients. So it's not really specific what is included in these allergen advisory statements. And these are voluntary, so they're not mandatory. We don't have regulations around them specifically for how to use these statements. And in the last column, we have the gluten-free labeling requirements. And these, as I said, are covered under Title 21 in the Code of Federal Regulations under section part 101.91. And these would be the gluten-containing grains like wheat, rye, barley, and crossbreeds. And what we have in order to use these terms, they have to meet the requirements of the rule that I just talked about, the rules. And so these are these are autoimmune diseases that are not IgE mediated. So that's how it differs from other allergens. And the gluten-free labeling rule is voluntary, but if a manufacturer chooses to use the gluten-free claim, they have to meet the requirements of the regulation. So I hope this helps to clarify, this table helped to clarify the differences between our labeling regulations for allergens and gluten. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to touch on is the Codex, or the Codex Alimentarius, which are the international food standard guidelines and codes of practice that contribute to safety and quality and fairness of international food trade. So Codex Standard 118-1979 covers standards for foods for special dietary use for persons intolerant to gluten. So their standard is in line with our requirements, where they also follow the less than 20 parts per million gluten requirement. Codex does not directly address the issue of hydrolyzed and fermented gluten in their standards. They do indicate that gluten-free foods can include ingredients from gluten-containing grains that have been processed to remove gluten, but they do not mention what those processes may be. They also indicate that the R5 ELISA method should be used for gluten determination, but they don't specify the type of ELISA. Like, they don't say whether it's a sandwich or a competitive ELISA. So although there may be some slight differences between our and Codex standards, it is important to keep in mind that imported foods are subject to US regulations. And then finally, I wanted to show you some of the references that we have that I discussed in the presentation. You can find the two rules that I discussed in the Federal Register at the following links. And then the last link is the question and answers that we have developed that's on our website. And we would be very happy to provide these links to you, to everyone in the webinar. And thank you very much for your attention. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Yingqing Ma, who will talk about gluten-free compliance and enforcement activities.
Thank you so much, Carol. Good afternoon, everyone. I also would like to thank the Celiac Disease Foundation for providing this great opportunity for us to share FDA gluten-free enforcement activities. FDA has been very active in the area of food allergens and gluten. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I would like to cover some background information, how to report issues to the FDA, how FDA follows up on consumer complaints, and examples of FDA enforcement activities. These are examples, these are hypothetical examples, but are based on actual cases. Next slide, please. We are committed to protect the health of consumers with celiac disease. For gluten-free labeling violations, FDA uses our misbranding charge under Section 403A1 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to take enforcement actions. We can monitor industry compliance through a variety of ways, including sampling and inspection. These can be general or targeted, both domestic and imported products. Activities may be performed by FDA or state regulatory partners under contract to FDA. In addition, we also follow up on consumer complaints and adverse events. We really appreciate consumers and other stakeholders alert FDA of certain product concerns. You can report issues to FDA in mainly two ways. You can report online using the MedWatch form, or you can call FDA, either the FDA Consumer Complaint Coordinator for the state in which you reside, or the general 188 Safe Food number. You'll be directed to the right person. Next slide, please. If you submit a complaint or adverse event to FDA, we encourage that you provide as much information as possible to help us act quickly. When submitted information does not have a lot of details about the product or was submitted anonymously, it may delay our action as we would not have the appropriate information to follow up. Some helpful information to include about the product include, for example, when and where the product was purchased, codes or identifying marks on the product, such as lot number, expiration date, and UPC code, pictures of the product that includes the ingredient list, claims, firm names, and firm contact information. Please also provide other relevant information that you believe is helpful to the FDA. For example, if you notice the change of color or shape of the product and suspect that a wrong product was packaged into a container with the gluten-free claim. If there is an adverse event, it would be helpful to include information such as the date of the consumption, reaction experienced, medical history of celiac disease, symptoms experienced, and how the symptoms related to prior reactions, medication or medical care received, if any, and any other relevant medical conditions you feel would be important for FDA to know. Adverse events are reviewed by FDA medical officers. With the detailed information, our medical officers can help determine the potential linkage to the product. Next slide, please. Many of you asked about FDA's process of following up on consumer complaints, and I'm happy to provide more information today. We use established procedures to conduct follow-up. Each incoming gluten-free complaint or adverse event is evaluated case by case. Once a consumer complaint or adverse event is received, it is sent to staff in multiple organizational units within FDA for awareness, input, and follow-up. Typically, the group would include consumer complaint coordinators, our labeling experts, our policy experts, analytical experts, compliance officers, our field investigators, and in the case of adverse events, our medical officers. We would first evaluate the information provided by the consumer, and based on our initial evaluation, we initiate a variety of follow-up actions. For example, for an obvious violation, we would promptly alert the firm and request recalls and other corrective actions, such as label update. In many cases, we need more information to determine a violation and health hazard. We may conduct our own internet search about the firm, the product, and the label. We may evaluate our own internal database for information about the firm, product, prior inspection history, or similar complaints. We may also follow up with the firm directly to get additional information about the product, the label, ingredients, their suppliers, and manufacturing process. If the firm provides testing results, we may inquire about their sampling and testing procedures and methodologies. And when necessary, we would conduct our own sampling and testing as a follow-up. So FDA's case-by-case approach is also informed by our food safety hazard evaluation. Our science-based and risk-based enforcement approach allows FDA to effectively protect public health, including during the COVID-19 pandemic. In certain cases, based on FDA evaluation and information provided by the firm, we may determine that the product meets the gluten-free labeling requirement and no other follow-up is warranted. And I hope this gives you a general idea of how we conduct follow-up activities for each gluten-free complaint. This also highlights the importance of providing detailed information in the complaint for us to act quickly. After FDA follow-up, firm actions could include recalls, market withdrawals, label updates, reformulation, and other corrective actions as appropriate. And for people who have submitted complaints or adverse events to FDA, you may have wondered why FDA didn't get back to you regarding the outcome. And I would like to explain that we really appreciate the information, but as a regulatory agency, FDA would discuss specific regulatory and enforcement activities only with those responsible for the product. Although not all FDA actions are publicly available, we do publish the most significant regulatory actions. For example, FDA recalls are posted on a searchable FDA enforcement report database. I have provided the link here. The database includes many gluten-free recalls. FDA also posts company announcements of recalls, market withdrawals, or safety alerts. Typically, for gluten-free recalls, the two main root causes are first, the product contained a gluten-containing ingredient, and second, the level of gluten due to cross-contact was 20 ppm or more. Our enforcement activities cover both conventional food products and dietary supplements. Next slide, please. I will provide 2 examples of FDA follow-up to consumer complaints. Again, as I mentioned earlier, because FDA is a regulatory agency, we only discuss enforcement issues with those responsible for the product. Therefore, these examples are hypothetical for explanation purpose, but nonetheless are based on real enforcement cases. Well, in the first example, FDA examined the label. Wheat was a sub-ingredient in a seasoning mix, but the product was labeled as gluten-free. FDA reached out to the firm. The root cause was that the firm did not perform adequate review of the product label. For corrective action, the firm conducted recall and reformulated the product to remove wheat in the seasoning mix. For the second example, FDA learned that the product contained fermented soy sauce made from wheat, but the product was labeled as gluten-free. FDA reached out to the firm. The root cause was that the firm relied on unvalidated testing method and did not fully understand FDA's gluten-free requirements for hydrolyzed and fermented ingredients. The firm conducted a recall and updated their label to remove the gluten-free claim. So in closing, FDA is very committed to protect the health of consumers with celiac disease. And we have ongoing work to monitor industry compliance, take appropriate regulatory actions, and further educate industry to encourage voluntary compliance. So thank you. And I'm going to hand it over to Marilyn, as I know you may have some questions for us, and we would be happy to take questions.
So thank you very, very much to our FDA colleagues. And I want to let everybody listening today know that in addition to providing you with the link of the recording, we will provide you with the links that were in the slides and the tips for reporting actions as well. So Dr. McKinnon, this one is for you. So will gluten, rye, or barley ever be added to the contained statement on food label? Some members of our celiac disease community have said that the recent draft allergen guidance did not provide for gluten-containing grades to be listed in the contained statement.
Great, and it's great to have the opportunity to clarify on this. So Carol covered a little bit of this in her presentation, and the draft guidance that so that everybody's clear, that draft guidance that you're referring to, that's the one that was entitled Evaluating the Public Health Importance of Food Allergens Other than the Major Food Allergens Listed in the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. And that was issued for comment in April of this year. Recently, the comment period closed on that. But just to take a step back on the issue, and to give some more background. So there are adverse reactions that are immune mediated and others that are not immune mediated. So like lactose intolerance, for instance. Of those that are immune mediated, some are IgE mediated and those that are not. So IgE meaning immunoglobulin E antibody. So if it's IgE mediated, an example there would be an anaphylactic reaction to peanuts, for instance. But those that are immune mediated but not IgE mediated, I know it sounds a little complicated, but an example there would be like the reactions to gluten for those with celiac disease. And the draft guidance that you're referring to, that one is focused on the IgE mediated food allergens. So as Carol mentioned earlier, there's in the order of 160 food allergens, 9 of which are listed as the major food allergens. And that draft guidance includes information on how stakeholders can submit requests to FDA on those allergens and how FDA will evaluate the data in those submissions. It does not prevent others from submitting requests like citizen petitions or letters to FDA. And with regard to the contain statement, I'd just say that the contain statement is one of the ways that Congress provided for the declaration of the major food allergens. And only Congress can change the list of the major food allergens. So I'll pause there. Let me just see if Carol or Yinqing have anything to add on that. If not,
I think you covered well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so this one's for Dr. DeLima, Carol. So what does gluten cross-contact mean in the context of the gluten-free labeling regulations?
Thank you, Marilyn. That's a great question. So cross-contact is not specifically defined in the gluten-free rule, but in the context of our gluten-free labeling requirements, cross-contact generally refers to the unavoidable presence of gluten in a food due to contact with gluten-containing foods like wheat, rye, barley, or their crossbred hybrids. So the US grain standard allow commodity grains, legumes, and seeds to contain a small percentage of another commodity grain as a result of commingling during production. So the presence of gluten in grain, legume, or seeds that is naturally free of gluten from this type of commingling is an example of cross-contact. So the typical practice of crop rotation, as well as shared use of harvesting and transport equipment and storage silos, often results in gluten-containing grains coming into contact with other grains that are naturally free of gluten. Furthermore, manufacturing facilities that use shared equipment to produce foods both with and without gluten could result in gluten cross-contact. Any grain other than gluten-containing grains of wheat, rye, barley, or their crossbred hybrids can be labeled gluten-free if it meets the definition, including that the presence of unavoidable gluten due to cross-contact situations is less than 20 parts per million. Now, with regard to gluten-free labeling of hydrolyzed and fermented foods, since the final food cannot be tested for the presence of gluten because there are no scientifically valid detection methods, our regulation for these types of food has record-keeping requirements where we require documentation that any potential for gluten cross-contact has been adequately assessed by the manufacturer. And where there is potential for cross-contact, the manufacturer has implemented measures to prevent introduction of gluten into the food during the process. So as you can see, cross-contact is very important, and manufacturers have to pay a great deal of attention to cross-contact when it comes to using the gluten-free claim.
So if a product says that it's gluten-free, labeled gluten-free, but then it has a statement that it's made on shared equipment or in a factory that processes wheat, the reason that they can still claim that the product is gluten-free is because it has been tested to less than 20 parts per million, even if it's made in a shared factory. Is that?
Yeah, but no gluten-containing grain can be used in it. So only due to cross-contact. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, and Dr. Ma, can you tell us more about the FDA's efforts in gluten testing?
Certainly. Well, first of all, for gluten-free labeling enforcement activities, in many cases, testing is not necessary because, as Carol mentioned during her part of the presentation, the regulation is not solely based on the 20 ppm level. For example, if a product contains a gluten-containing grain that has not been processed to remove gluten, FDA can take action without testing because we can already establish based on the label that the product has violated the gluten-free labeling requirements. In the presentation, I discussed, I had a focus on following up on gluten-free complaints, but we also have initiatives to do our industry compliance surveillance sampling. So, and again, as I mentioned during the presentation, FDA sampling can be general or targeted. For general sampling, we can cover a variety of products or brands on the US market or products being imported into the US. For example, in fiscal years 2015 and 2016, FDA tested over 700 domestic samples from 3 commodity groups: cereals, grain bars, and flours. More than 250 types of products were analyzed as part of this effort. And of all the products tested, a few samples of one product contained gluten above the regulatory limit of 20 ppm. So the compliance rate was greater than 99.5%. A recall was conducted to remove the volatile products from the market. In addition, the firm conducted root cause analysis and promptly implemented additional corrective actions to prevent reoccurrence. FDA also conducted subsequent testing of the products from the firm and did not find levels of gluten above 20 ppm. As another example, I just talked about domestic sampling. And in fiscal years 2017 and 2018, FDA tested close to 140 imported samples with the gluten-free claim, and none of the samples had gluten above 20 ppm. Well, in addition to general sampling, FDA can conduct targeted sampling of products. We can target specific products and brands or specific products from a firm. Again, both domestic and imported products. In some cases, these would be products mentioned in the consumer complaints or are suspected to be violative. So we have ongoing effort and will continue to evaluate products with the voluntary gluten-free claim, both domestic and imported, and we'll conduct testing when warranted. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. So for anyone who has questions, again, just please submit them to info@celiac.org. And any questions that come from today, in addition to providing you the links and the tips and tricks here, we'll make certain that we get your questions answered. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Hilary Croft of Celiac UK and AOECS.
Eventually managed to get the technology to work. So good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, good morning, if you're somewhere that it's earlier in the day. Thank you so much, Marilyn and the Celiac Disease Foundation, for giving me the opportunity to present today. First of all, I just wanted to explain why I think I'm qualified to say something on this matter. And first of all, it's because I'm actually the mum of a young man with celiac disease who I've been supporting for the past 11 years on a gluten-free diet. Secondly, I've spent around about 25 years in and around the food industry in a mixture of retailing, manufacturing, distribution, and more recently in food poverty. And now I'm Chief Executive of Celiac UK and also a board member of the Association of European Celiac Societies, as Marilyn explained earlier, otherwise known as AOECS. So I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you today briefly, just to give you a little bit of a flavour as to the development of gluten-free labelling in Europe and the differences between Europe and the US. I put versus, sounds like it's a competition, which it obviously isn't, but just to explain some of those differences and to talk a little bit about the trademark that we use to label and to identify gluten-free products in Europe. So we've already heard a little bit around Codex. So both in North America and in Europe, Codex is the worldwide kind of basis for the standard that's been developed. But obviously each country is responsible for their own legislation in detail. And the purpose of this slide is really just to give you a bit of a flavour of the kind of history of how the labelling regulations have developed for gluten-free foods. So it was initially identified in 1979 that there would be a gluten-free standard, but at that point there wasn't actually any form of analysis for gluten, there was an approximation that was being done using nitrogen, which was the only way in which they could identify actually whether there may be a presence of gluten in products. And at that point, it was actually 200 parts per million was the standard that was being promoted as being safe for people with celiac disease, which obviously we know now is not appropriate. And really, obviously, what's happened since then is a lot of different tests have been developed, which have allowed us to be much more specific about actually what is safe and what we can test, which has resulted in 2008 with the R5 enzyme, the ELISA method, which I think Carol first mentioned earlier, and the lower threshold of 20 parts per million being the global kind of standard for the identification of foods being labelled as gluten-free. So in the EU in 2009, following that work by Codex, there was the first law introduced around gluten-free food. And the other thing to note, which I suppose I'll come on to in a minute, is one of the differences is that fermentation and hydrolysis are accepted as a process for reducing gluten as well as part of that. This regulation was updated in 2014 to specifically look at allergen labelling legislation, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, and also to be very clear about actually the terms that could be used on packaging to identify products that were gluten-free. And I think that was only the term gluten-free could be used in Europe. So we've heard quite a lot already about the allergens that are available, that are identified in the US. In the EU, there are actually 14 allergens that are identified. So, and I think the main thing to highlight here is that all cereals containing gluten have to be specifically identified as allergens on labels in the EU. I won't go through each of those, but they speak for themselves. And this is the difference in the US. So it's specifically wheat is the allergen that's identified, but not necessarily other grains containing gluten, which I guess was the question that was asked earlier as well. So just to summarize, I suppose the key similarities and differences between the EU and the USA. Overall, the threshold is the same. So 20 parts per million is the threshold that we are both using. In terms of the labelling, I've already said that actually in the EU you have to highlight those products that are allergens in bold in the ingredients list, and that's not the case, not the same in the US in terms of the number of products that are highlighted. In the EU, fermentation and hydrolysis is accepted as a process to remove gluten, and the point that's been made about the test methodology around that. So in the EU, we're using the recommended testing by Codex, but there is more analysis being done on trying to find better methods of testing. And there's a link here that you'll see for a piece of research, Professor Katarina Scherf, who we work very closely with at Celiac UK, around research into the method. There's a link there to a video where she explains a little bit more about the test methodology and some research into looking specifically at hydrolyzed and fermented products. And those obviously apply to things like beers and vinegars. And in both countries or both areas, distillation is accepted as a process to remove gluten. So that is a similarity. Just jumping onto the cross-grain trademark, which you can see there on the right of the screen. This is a trademark that was first being used in the 1980s. It's been a long-established mark for gluten-free food in Europe and is globally registered. It's used worldwide now, initially in Europe and beyond. And it really gives confidence to people foods genuinely do give confidence that they generally are gluten-free. They go beyond just the kind of labeling. So I think that's the point really to make, is that actually there's a standard that sits behind this, that people who want a license to use this trademark have to meet a certain set of standards, which includes an independent audit of production facilities and analysis of the products. And also there is governance and checking by the celiac societies who are running the schemes in different countries across Europe to make sure that there is full compliance. It's fair to say that the AOECS standard meets the requirements that are set out by Codex, but wherever the cross-grain trademark is being used, it has to comply with the laws, the food laws in that individual country. And obviously in USA, we've already heard about the laws that apply here. In terms of the AOECS standards, so the Association of European Societies own the standard that the cross-grain symbol has to adhere to in order to be applied on products, and that has a number of things within it. It defines what gluten-free means in terms of what qualifies as being gluten-free. It defines the analytical methods of testing that have to be used, and it spends quite a lot of time looking at this issue around cross-contamination of products to make sure there are the appropriate controls to prevent cross-contamination of gluten, including the full production side and around raw material supply, production, storage, transportation, handling, and cleaning operations, and also information about how the actual label should be applied. From a consumer perspective, the mark is internationally recognised. The research across Europe has shown that 78% of people trust products more that have a cross-grain symbol rather than just the words. Obviously, it transcends all languages, and 95% of people want to see more use of the cross-grain trademark on gluten-free foods. It's really a clear visual communication that products are safe and avoiding contamination, and really in terms of the trust and reassurance that it can make to ensure that proper audit processes and compliance with those has been checked. And I think the other thing is that the fact that this is endorsed and promoted by people who eating gluten-free is a requirement for their health because they have celiac disease or intolerance to gluten in other ways, I think also is another reassurance for people that this is key for them. That's really all I was going to say. Obviously some differences around the edges, but 20 parts per million is the same. And I'm going to, at this point, hand over to Marilyn. And once again, thank you for your attention.
So again, my absolute sincere thanks to all of you for joining us here, and to the FDA and to Celiac UK and AOECS for their participation in this important event for our patient community. Again, if you have any questions, please submit them to info@celiac.org, and we will be providing you a recorded link, and again with the links that you've seen today, as well as those responses in November. So again, thank you everyone.